Some of you who've been watching my channel from the very beginning may remember this guy. It was one of the first series I did on the channel, and I covered sculpting up this guy and moulding and casting it. And a few of you may even own copies of the sculpture that I produced at the time. Now, the mould came out well enough, but there were certain aspects of it that I wasn't particularly happy with. Primarily, the sculpture actually shifted slightly in the mould when I made the original piece. I also found that because I'd done this as one piece with the base and the sculpture together, it was actually quite unwieldy. It was quite a big mould, it was quite tall, and it's quite difficult to use. So I've always meant to come back and have another go at this, and in a previous video you would have seen me recreate this sculpture by pouring some molten clay into the mould. So I've since re-sculpted the piece and I'm going to have another go at moulding it. This is part of a wider, longer term project that I've been working on. I've done various busts over the years, and you may remember these guys from a previous video as well. I always intended to mould and cast these up and make them available, so I've been slowly working towards this. So over the last year or so I've been moulding various of my sculptures with a view to making them available. So in this video I'm going to focus on this bat creature specifically, and go through all the various problems and solutions that I found when creating the mould. As I've mentioned, the first mould that I made had various problems with it, so I decided to make another matrix mould. But as you'll see, there were various problems with this one as well, and that led me to finally make a third mould to attempt to get rid of some of those problems. So we're just going to go through all the various stages of that and sort of talk about some of the problems that I encountered while I was doing it. So I'm going to be making a new matrix mould for this sculpture. So what I'm doing is cutting out some polystyrene pieces to hold the sculpture in place. What I'm going to be doing is building a clay wall around the sculpture, and that will define a mould separation between the two halves of the mould. So I'm just using a hot glue gun here to put some blocks of polystyrene in place, and I'm going to slowly build up a wall around the sculpture. You essentially want a platform that surrounds the sculpture, so you've got a good surface area around the outside. You want to make sure that it's very easy for the two halves of your mould to meet, so having a wide surface area around the edge is really useful. For those of you unfamiliar with what a matrix mould is, what you do is you take your subject and you cover half of it in clay, and the clay defines where the silicon will go in the mould. You then give it a hard case over that clay, then you flip it over and add the second layer of clay on the other side. The clay simulates where the silicon will sit in the mould. You then add another hard case on the side of that, take the clay away, and then pour in silicon to fill that void. Once that's set, you then flip the mould over again and pour silicon into the other side, thus creating a two-part mould with silicon on the interior of a hard case. The advantage of that is it allows you to define precisely where the silicon will go, and that can be quite economical. Obviously silicon's quite expensive, so if you can minimise the amount you use, then obviously you're going to save yourself some money. You can of course just pour silicon straight over your sculpture, as I'm doing here, and in many ways that is a bit easier. You don't need to worry about making hard cases, all that sort of stuff, and so it's a lot quicker, but obviously the downside is you do use a hell of a lot more silicon, so there's swings and roundabouts to both approaches. So now I've got my platform in place, I'm now covering the sculpture in cling film. I'm going to be covering this in clay in a second, and this is just to make sure that the sculpture doesn't get too messy. What I'm also doing here is taping in some blocks of polystyrene. These are going to act as mould keys so that the two halves of the mould line up precisely. So I'm just smoothing the clay layer over the top of my sculpture out, and as I said, where you put clay is where the silicon will go, so you want to make sure you have a decent thickness of silicon over your sculpture. So now that's in place, I'm now covering the entire thing in a layer of fiberglass. Now that that's set, I can flip the piece over and start preparing the other side. And it's the same process again. I'm covering the back of the sculpture with cling film and then giving that a layer of clay as well. Now as you can see here, what I'm doing is brushing on a layer of Vaseline. The reason I'm doing that is it's going to act as a separating agent between the two halves of the fiberglass. Without that, the two halves would stick together and thus make it really hard for you to get the two halves of your mould apart. Now this is a process I've used for years and I've never really had a problem with it, but I am using a slightly different brand of polyester resin here, and what I actually found was after this had set, I found it really difficult to actually get the two halves of the mould apart, which was a little bit disconcerting. What I've subsequently taken to doing is actually giving two halves of the mould a layer of aluminium tape, and that way they come apart very, very easily. So that's something I learned off the back of this. And actually this small mistake here is actually something that caused me quite a lot of problems later on, because I had to use quite a lot of force to separate the two halves of the mould. I think what that actually did was to cause a bit of displacement with the mould jacket, and that led to the mould lines on the casts from this mould being a little bit more pronounced than I would have liked. So it's a sort of a lesson here really that small mistakes like this can actually have quite major impacts later on. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit though. So having now got the two halves of my mould open, I can now clear out the clay and start preparing the mould to pour some silicone in. Now what I'm doing here is keeping the clay and putting it in a measuring jug. And that's just so I know how much silicone I actually am going to need when I come to pour that into that side of the mould. So far I haven't needed to be too precise with the clay that I've put onto the sculpture. This is the point now where the silicone is actually going to be touching the sculpture, so I need to define the clay wall very precisely. So you've seen me do this in previous videos, but I'm basically going through, smoothing out the clay against the sculpture and making sure there's a very clear transition between the clay wall and the sculpture. This is where the mould separation is going to be, so you want to be very precise because you don't want mould lines that are too pronounced. Now obviously I've mentioned that didn't work out too well in this case, but nevertheless you need to be as precise with this as you can be to minimise that as much as possible. Smoothing things out with a brush and water is a really good way of getting a nice smooth finish as well. Now you also need to think about where the air is going to go in the sculpture. So as you can see I was pushing some old bits of electrical wiring in here to create some air channels. The problem with this particular sculpture is it's got these very thin ears, so you need to make sure that the air can escape so you don't get air bubbles at the tips of the ears. So in this case I'm running the air channels from the tips of the ears to the shoulders, then also from the shoulders back out again. Okay, so we're now ready to go. So as you can see I've drilled a hole and put a bit of pipe in the back. That's just so I've got a very clear channel where to pour the silicone. So I can now mix up my silicone and then start pouring that in. So I'm doing this slowly, giving air time to escape. And what I'm also doing is drilling some bleed holes in the case. That's just to make sure that silicone's actually getting to the various points of the sculpture and that there aren't any obvious air bubbles. Once you've got some silicone leaking out, you can be sure that silicone's got where it needs to get, so you can just seal those back up again. Right, I've left that overnight so I can now release my clamps and turn the mould over. Right, there we go, looking good so far. So obviously this needs a bit of a clean up, and I can also clear the clay out of the other half of the mould jacket. Now in order to make this job easier, what I did was to spray the clay with this stuff beforehand. This is just a wax mould release, and it means that the clay doesn't stick to the fiberglass, so that really helps speed things up. I've spent many hours in the past cleaning out fiberglass moulds with water-based clay, and it does take forever and it's a real pain, so that definitely saves a fair bit of work. Now scrape away the larger blobs of clay, but because this is water-based clay, a really nice way to clear this up is just to pour some water over it and brush it down with a paintbrush. Because this is sculpted in Chauvin, obviously that's oil-based, so the water won't disturb the sculpture at all. Now once again I'm using a mould release to make sure the two halves of the mould don't stick together. In this case it's the silicone that I don't want to stick together, so I'm just giving that a layer of Vaseline as well. In this case the mould separation worked very well for the silicone, and the Vaseline stopped the two halves sticking together. So once again it's the same process as before. Clamp the two halves of the mould together and then pour the silicone in. So that's now set, so I can crack the mould open, and that's looking pretty good. So here's the first cast from the mould, and at first glance this is looking really good. I've pressure cast this, so I've got no problem with air bubbles, and my air channels have worked really well. So I was quite happy with that for a while, but then I started looking at it a bit more closely and I started thinking, you know what, actually I'm not sure this is going to be good enough. Now obviously I want to put these in my Etsy store, I want to sell these, and with resin busts there's always a certain degree of cleanup expected. For anyone who's familiar with this, we know that mould lines are always a problem. And even the best moulds always have a mould line. I mean, if you look at stuff like Games Workshop, you know, for example, large company, you buy a kit from them and it will have mould lines. Now obviously that's injection moulded plastic, so it's a very different process. Nevertheless, mould lines are still a problem there, so it's no surprise that small makers such as myself have this issue as well. And nevertheless, you do want to maintain a certain level of quality, so I was looking at the sculptures that I created and I was sort of thinking, oh, you know what, I'm not sure I'd be happy sending that out to someone. So this creature is quite smooth, although it's got some skin texture on it. It's quite a smooth creature, it's not like wrinkly or covered in fur like these guys, for example. So if you look at this cast, you can see on the side now there's a mould line on these sides of the neck. Now it's not too bad in certain places, but certainly on this side here I wasn't really too happy with it. Now it's going to take a fair bit of filing to get rid of that, and if you do file it down you're going to lose some of the skin texture that's been sculpted in. So it's actually quite a bit of a fix-up job for someone to do. Now obviously you could get yourself some milliput or some Aves epoxy or something and sculpt that back in. But I was sort of thinking, well, you know, is it really fair to ask someone who spent some money on this to actually do that level of work? Obviously they're expecting to do some cleanup, it's a resin model, but at the same time that actually seemed like a bit of a problem to me, and I don't think I'd be happy sending that out to someone, so I started thinking, okay, what can I do to actually fix that? So my first attempt was actually this, and what I decided to do was cut away part of the mould jacket and hold the two halves of the mould between two clamped pieces of wood, and then create a new mould jacket over it. The idea being that the two halves of the mould are compressed together and I could look into the mould through the pouring spout and I could see that the two halves of the mould were quite nicely aligned. On my previous version there was actually a bit of a gap between the two halves of the mould, and I think that had been caused by the problems I had in separating the two parts of the fiberglass case initially. I also thought perhaps that the fiberglass case I made wasn't quite thick enough. There was a little bit of give in the fiberglass, and I think those two factors meant that I was getting a wider separation in the two halves of the mould than was really ideal. So I thought, well, maybe I can clamp them together a little and fix it that way. So I gave that a go. I thought this is probably worth a go before I actually completely redo the mould. And it sort of worked, but I was getting distortion in other places, and some parts of the mould are actually more misaligned than they were previously. So in the end I just had to say, okay, I'm going to throw that one out and start again. And it did start me thinking, well, maybe in matrix mould isn't the best way of doing this. For other smaller pieces what I would do is literally embed the whole piece in silicone and then just cut the silicone at the back to free the piece. And after I find I get much smaller mould lines than I would with the matrix mould. So I started thinking, well, could I actually embed this sculpture completely in silicone and just cut the back? Now obviously it's quite a large sculpture compared to a small piece that I might use as a greebly or something like that. So it would take quite a lot of silicone to actually embed the whole thing. Now I have done that for my zombie sculpture, so in this case I did create a clay wall around the sculpture, but I didn't do a matrix mould. I just poured silicone over it in a container, flipped it over, did the same on the back. Now obviously I used quite a lot of silicone there, but actually I get really nice casts from the zombie mould, so there did seem to be something in that. Now obviously the zombie's textured is not as smooth as this model, so I think a lot of the mould lines are hidden in that detail, so I didn't think that was necessarily the way to go. But what I thought I could do was to use a similar approach to the matrix mould, that is to make a hard jacket in the same way as I have for the matrix mould in this case, but instead of creating a mould separation using a clay wall between the two halves of the silicone, I figured I would just pour the silicone in directly over the sculpture. That way I've got a layer of silicone all over the sculpture that hugs the surface of the sculpture quite closely. So I'm saving money because I'm not using too much silicone, but I also can now cut the silicone as opposed to relying on a mould line, and if I cut it I should then get a much smaller divide than I would do otherwise. So that seemed like a good approach, and that's what I decided to do. So here's the sculpture again, and this time what I've done is to attach it to a block of wood and then cover the whole thing in aluminium tape. That way the fiberglass won't stick to the wood. Obviously the wood's porous, very likely to stick, but the aluminium's got a nice smooth finish, so that should be a decent barrier. What I'm doing is covering the whole thing in cling film and then covering the whole thing in a layer of clay. I'm being very careful to get an equal thickness of clay over the entire sculpture here. And as before, where the clay goes is where the silicon's going to end up. Now, one thing I am doing here, which is something I've discussed with some of you in the comments on some of the previous videos actually, is creating a channel on the back of the sculpture. So I'm just putting these raised keys on the back, and where the keys are is where I'm going to cut. So the idea here is that it's much thicker, so when I cut the silicon, there's much more surface area to allow that to line up correctly. I'm also putting some keys on the front, and I'm adding a large piece of pipe to allow me some space to pour in the silicon. So as before, I need a wall here. That's a bit easier. I can just push some cardboard into the clay, and once again I've covered the whole thing in aluminium tape to give me a nice barrier to work against. So what I'm doing here, which is a little bit different from what I did previously, is to mix some plaster in with my polyester resin. What that does is create quite a nice paste that I can use as a first layer. What I tend to find with fiberglass is that because it's flat strips, they don't always capture the detail of the surface you're applying them to. And that can be a bit of a problem if you've got sort of sharp edges like I have on the keys and things like that. So what I'm doing is sort of smoothing out the surface area effectively by applying this layer of paste first, and that should make it easier to add these subsequent layers of fiberglass. Another advantage is this stuff seems to dry really hard. I'm not quite sure what it is about the interaction of plaster and polyester resin, but it's really tough. So that's also going to help me fix some of the problems I had with there being a bit of flex in the mould jacket. This should be pretty rigid and so should avoid any of those sorts of problems. So I'm now proceeding to add a layer of fiberglass over this, and I'm making sure that's really thick and really solid. Something I am using here is you can see I've got this purple brush and also purple mat. These are intended for cookery, but what they are is a silicone mat and a silicone brush. So what that means is any resin that I drop or any resin on the brush, once it's set, can easily be peeled away, and that just helps to clear up and also allows you to use the brush over and over again. If I was using a regular brush, obviously that would be ruined once the resin had hardened. So that's proved really useful. And actually these brushes are slightly different to some of the ones I've used previously because the entire thing's silicone. Some of the other ones I'd had was like a plastic handle with a silicone head, and obviously that can get a bit messed up after a while, but these should last for quite a while because you can just peel off any resin that sets on them, so that's really useful. So that's now set, so I can now pull away the cardboard from the other side of the mould and start working on the second half of the mould jacket. Now once again, a lesson learned from the previous time, so what I'm doing is covering the entire side of that mould in aluminium foil, and that means that the two halves of the mould will come apart very easily. There's no chance of them sticking together because there's an actual aluminium barrier between the two halves. So once again, exactly the same process, layer of plaster and resin paste first, and then cover the entire thing in fiberglass. And as I was mentioning, you can just peel away the resin very easily from the brush there. You actually get quite a nice interesting pattern there, so it might even be worth keeping some of these for another project. But anyway, just a useful little tip there. Right, so the two halves are set, so I'm now just drilling some holes in the side, so that'll allow me to put some bolts in at a later stage. I can now peel the two halves of the mould apart. Now that I've got the clay off, I can see that there is one other drawback here, and that is that I've obviously subjected the sculpture to a little bit more mechanical pressure than you normally would, so there's some damage to the sculpture. Nothing too severe, but it will take a little bit of clean up just to get that right before I make the mould. Right, so there we go, so there's the sculpture sitting in the fiberglass shell, and as you can see that follows the contours of the sculpture quite nicely. So now thinking about how the mould's actually going to work, what I've actually done is add some sections on the back of the ears here, and that's to allow the casting material to flow into the cavity in the mould once it's completed. I'm going to be attaching some pouring spouts to these areas, but because they're quite thin, I thought I would make them long so there's more area for the resin to actually flow into when I come to pour the final piece. Now I'm putting that back into the jacket, and as you can see I actually modified this slightly and added some piping to the top of the jacket. I was a little bit unsure about how precisely I was going to do this, and I think this is one of the things with this particular sculpture which was an issue which I hadn't really considered. Now because I always use these 15mm pipes as the stem for the sculpture, it's very logical to think, well, that's where I'll pour the resin in. So you pour the resin in through the large cavity where the pipe would be, that all comes through, you have air channels to allow the air to escape from the ears, and then you just put a piece of pipe into the mould, and there you go. Now that's fine, but obviously when I was doing this type of mould I couldn't put the air channels in so easily because there's no mould separation. I couldn't include those channels, so I had to think of a different way of allowing the air to escape from the ears here. So what I started thinking was, well, why don't I actually ignore the aperture where the 15mm pipe would be and instead pour the resin in through the ears. They're the two high points of the sculpture, so it was sort of made logical sense that that's where the resin should go. So I started thinking, okay, well, if I create some pouring spouts attached to each of the ears, I can have a plug that goes where the 15mm pipe would be and pour the resin in from the top instead. Obviously you might get some trapped air in the head, for example, but I figured if I just rotate the mould as I'm pouring all that sort of stuff, I should be able to free that air. So that's the approach I've gone for here. So there's the two halves of the mould attached, and what I'm doing is putting these plugs into the two pouring spouts, and I've just attached these old casts to the inside. They're just going to create some pouring spouts in the silicone for me. So I can now pour some silicone into the large aperture in the front and let that set. Right, so there we go, so there's my silicone mould. So what I now need to do is start cutting this to free the sculpture. Now, as I mentioned, I've put these ridges on the back, so that should allow me some registration points to get the two halves of the mould to line up. So I'm just cutting along those lines to free the sculpture. Now, you do occasionally get to keep your sculpture when you take it out of the mould, but not in this case. I actually chucked his head halfway across the workshop trying to get it out. Right, so there we go. So there's the silicone back in the case and the case bolted together. Now, as you can see, what I've done is to actually cut some holes in the back of the fiberglass jacket. And the reason for that is because there's always the potential for the model to become misaligned. Because I have these thin channels on the back, which is where I've cut it, they have to fit precisely back into the fiberglass jacket, and it's quite possible for them to be misaligned. So what I've done is to cut some holes in the back away from the mould separations. And that's just so I can see if the mould isn't actually sitting quite right in the jacket. If it is, these should line up quite precisely, and they do, so that's looking pretty good. So of course I've got three ways of getting resin into the sculpture now. I've got the original aperture where the 15mm copper pipe will go, but I've also got these two apertures at the top where the ears are as well. And what I actually ended up doing was doing a sort of a hybrid approach. So what I do is to plug the two channels by the ears, pour resin in through the aperture at the bottom. I then give it a shake, try and release as much of the air as I can. I then put the copper pipe in place, but I have the copper pipe blocked so that the resin can't escape. I then turn the mould back over, pull the plugs out where the ears are, and that allows any air that's trapped in the mould to escape. I then give it a further shake, turn it around, make sure I get rid of as much of the air as I possibly can. I can then top up the resin if I need to, and that then goes into the pressure chamber and cures in there. So I've done that process, and this is the first cast that's coming out of the mould. So yeah, not looking too bad. It does actually look like the resin has dropped down slightly below the level of the ears, so although they sort of do look solid there's actually some air bubbles right in the top. I could have rectified that just by pouring in a little bit of resin after I took it out of the pressure chamber and letting that cure, so that's not a disaster. But that's definitely an improvement on the previous cast that I had. The mould lines are now on the back, they're not too pronounced, so that's good. So all in all, I think that's an improvement over the previous mould. So as you can see, there's been a bit of progress on this since I made the mould, and I've had a number of castings out of this, and there's a bit of a progression with these. Now at first glance they all sort of look the same, but there are various differences between them. So on the left here is one of the casts from the previous mould. As you can see, I've got that pronounced mould line on the side, which was the initial problem that led me to make a new mould. As I said before, it's fixable, but I think more pronounced than I would be happy sending out. So that's what led to me initially deciding to make a new mould in the first place. Now this is the mould that I attempted to fix, and again, as you can see, there's still some distortion on the sides there. There's a bit of a pronounced mould line, and actually there's some quite pronounced distortion on one of the ears as well. So in the end, that fix didn't really work. I wasn't really sure that it would anyway, but it seemed like it was worth a go. So moving on, this is a cast that we've just seen, and now the mould lines are on the back of the mould and are much less pronounced. So I think that's a more desirable position to have. Obviously, we'd like it if there were no mould lines whatsoever, but that's just not the way these things go, unfortunately. In this case, obviously the ears have got some air bubbles, but I could have easily fixed that if I'd realised before I took it out of the mould. Obviously all of these ones that are slightly dodgy I'm going to be fixing up and painting, so they're not going to go to waste. So there's another cast from the mould, and again, mould lines on the back, but probably more easily fixable than on the sides, so happy with that. Now this is one that went wrong from the new mould, and what actually happened here was that the back of the mould got a bit misaligned, and I mentioned that it might be slightly difficult for those channels of silicone to fit back into the mould jacket easily, and this is a situation where that happened. And as you can see, there's some quite pronounced mould lines there because the mould was misaligned. So in order to fix that, what I did was to actually cut some additional holes into the back of the mould jacket along the lines of where the mould meets. That way I can actually see if these are misaligned, so that allowed me to fix that problem. I've also got this zombie sculpture here, and as you can see there is some flashing around the edges and some mould lines, but as I mentioned, because this character is quite textured and there's quite a lot of detail in it, I don't think those lines matter so much. You can lose them much more easily in the detail. Similar with this goat creature, he's furry, you know, he's got some various details on him, so again you can lose those lines quite simply. I think it's really just a problem for this bat creature, partly because it's a smoother creature, so you're going to notice those mould lines much more, but also because he's got these big ears. He's actually quite an awkward shape to make a mould from, so that's partly why this has been such a tricky one to do. Nevertheless, got there in the end, so that was a bit of a journey, but probably worthwhile. It's always a learning experience. So as I mentioned, these are going up in the Etsy store, so if anyone would like one, I know a few of you have emailed asking, they will be available now, so I'll put a link in the description. But thanks for sticking with me for that one. I hope that was interesting, and thanks for all the advice that various of you have given me in the comments on previous videos. It was really useful when I was putting these together. So thanks for that, but I think that's it. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.